Another snapshot of a divided electorate. But what made them vote? How do we explain what happened? The issues Americans voted for and against. The first thing to say was this was a massive turnout. Voters fired up in a way they usually only are when the presidency is in play.
We have, between the red and the blue, almost nothing in common. Our cultures are different, our societies are different, our beliefs are different, our views on social issues, particularly the hot button issues, are completely, diametrically different. And so one wonders how we're going to get back together, particularly because we have a president who succeeds by dividing people.
Donald Trump clearly energized Democrats. Millions who've looked in horror at his policies and conduct at last had a chance to say something about it. But a couple of issues seem to have kept the Democratic Party's advances in check.
If the radical Democrats take power, they will take a wrecking ball to our economy. A Republican Congress means more jobs. Democrats produce mobs. Republicans produce jobs.
Well, I don't think there's any question that the economy doing well was one of Trump's big strengths. He didn't use it that much. He seemed to spend the whole last week talking about some caravan coming up from Mexico. But certainly the economy was cited by a lot of voters.
I have never done this to her or to anyone.
Another issue that held the Democrats back was the so-called Kavanaugh effect. All but one of the Democratic Party senators up for re-election in battleground states who voted against Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation were defeated.
The one Democratic senator who voted yes on Kavanaugh, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, held on to his seat. So I think for a lot of conservatives in general, not just Trump supporters, but conservatives in general, the Kavanaugh hearings were a really interesting preview of what a democratically led Senate might look like, and it galvanized a lot of people to get out and vote and keep those Senate seats in Republican hands.
But mostly this wasn't a campaign where the parties were competing on the same issues.
Healthcare was on the ballot, and healthcare won.
According to the exit polls, healthcare was the single most important issue for voters. It's divisive because it goes to the fundamental question: how big, how active should the government be? And Donald Trump had his own divisive issue.
Caravan after caravan of illegal aliens.
Some people call it an invasion. It's like an invasion.
We have our military now on the border.
What Trump did worked. And it took a Republican base that was only moderately interested in the midterms and tuned them right up to a level of enthusiasm that actually matched the Democrats across the nation.
But some conservative commentators believe concentrating on immigration will eventually backfire for the Republicans.
Republicans are doing very badly with suburban educated women. And these women are driving a lot of these elections these days. They certainly were very important in this midterm election, and Republicans aren't doing well among those women. So there are a lot of groups that in the future, just both as a matter of demographics and numbers, are going to be deciding policy and deciding who gets elected, and Republicans are losing ground among those people.
So the US legislature now reflects the country it serves. Two houses with two different parties in control and precious little room in the centre.
David Grossman there. Just before we go to our guests, a quick whistle-stop tour through some of today's papers and see how they've been covering the results here. The Washington Post has Democrats seize the House, 3 women flip key House states in Virginia, the suburban women we were talking about, and the Washington Times has Democrats flip the House, the GOP holds the Senate. Trump's harsh tone, a liability for re-election, they say. Quite an interesting one here, if I can find it. Propelled by anger. This is one in the Daily News. I've got all my papers in a muddle here. And there's an interesting commentary here, which suggests that the advance of a liberal world disorder is on the rise. That's from the Washington Times. But let me introduce the historian Simon Schama, David Frum from The Atlantic. He's also former speechwriter for George W. Bush. It's great to have you both here. When you look at the results today, do you see a red party and a blue party each making gains, or do you see a centre, you know, an imperial centre and a kind of uprising around the edges? How do you...
No, I think it is more like the conventional wisdom is, for me anyway, correct, that actually both sides are digging in. It's become a commonplace to say there are two Americas living in a kind of parallel political existence. It's really weird in a way that they correspond to the two separate houses of Congress. And the Democrats, obviously, and their appeal, it's been said many times, to metropolitan areas and suburban people and small town and rural and white grievance America being represented or overrepresented, depending on your point of view, in the Senate.
What happens in any democracy is you pour the votes into the system, and depending on how the rules of the game operate, chug, 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 they get turned into seats in the legislature. In any other democracy but this one, had you poured these votes in, we would be talking about a massive victory for the party against the president. We don't have the exact popular vote total yet, but it's looking like the Democrats got at least 9 percentage points of the vote, more than the Republicans did in the elections to the House. Huge, huge advantage. I mean, in Britain, that would be an epic landslide.
But we also understand how electoral processes work, and we understand that if you don't go by the popular vote and it's not a referendum, then that's how the system works.
But so the important thing to understand about what just happened, if you're trying to make sense of it, is the United States, granted, it's not a pure democracy, never has been, but sometimes it approaches more close to that and sometimes farther away. From the First World War until the 1970s, the United States approached closer and closer to democratic outcomes. Since the 1970s, farther and farther away. And what's been happening in the past decade is the American political system, not just compared to 1787, but even compared to 15 or 20 years ago, it tracks much less closely to what went into the system, what comes out of the system.
Okay, so
I mean, it's weirder now. I would say, I don't know if that, I mean, that's a crude.
I mean, to make this very simple, the House is more representative of the American population, and the Senate, which is allowing each state 2 senators, is more representative of rural, smaller states.
Yes, well, that's what the founding fathers, you know, Jefferson in particular, had a nightmare. The virtuous, as he saw it, rural America, whether he'd sort of recognize, I think he actually would, you know, when he'd be looking at sort of some parts of the Midwest of the mountain states, he was worried it'd be overwhelmed by precisely the kind of America that was absolutely wonderful catnip for Alexander Hamilton, the big city, the pulse of the economic engine, sociability, and so on. So the founding fathers set up this, on one hand, you can think of it as actually a brilliantly wise system of checks and balances, but the Electoral College and the deliberate overrepresentation of small states in the Senate was calculated. And the issue is now, how much of a spanner in the works is it?
Let me throw a more short-term view. I remember election night 2000, and which led to the George W. Bush administration in which I served. At that time, that was the first time since the 19th century that the winner of the presidency had not been the winner of the popular vote. And we all found that even on the winning side, a very disturbing outcome. And we explained it to ourselves as a freak. This is always something that was theoretically possible in the United States. It hadn't happened for 100 years. It probably wouldn't happen for 100 years again. So get over it. The system's working. And it's been happening since 2000 again and again and again, more and more rapidly.
You know that Republicans in power would be saying right now, this is what happens when the Liberals are out of power. This is how they whine. This is what they say. You got Obama twice. The system worked in the middle. So, you know...
David's not a liberal.
Yeah.
I understand.
Not at all liberal.
Well,
David's a constitutionalist.
Well, relative to now, what you're seeing, you know, in terms of...
But I think one of the things I think that people don't understand, even Americans, never mind British people, is the rules today are not the same rules that were there in 2008. The rules are actually the rules are changing at an accelerating pace. It's not just the concentration of population. The rules are actually getting more favorable to the Republicans and less favorable to the Democrats, and that's one of the reasons why this event, this breakthrough in the House, has been a shock to the president. and why it represents such a challenge to him.
I want to delve in a little bit more to the cultural side of things, because, you know, no one will forget the kind of, you know, the phrases that were overused on the election campaign in 2016. This was an election about the left behinds, about anger. It's interesting to see in these headlines the resurgence of anger again. Now, do you think these blue-collar workers, Ohio, Pennsylvania, the states he picked up, Michigan, are still behind the president?
We know that's not true.
We know there's an anger exhaustion. For example, the Democrats did very well in Iowa. They did incredibly well in Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer, who won the governorship she absolutely romped over her Republican rival. So
what does that mean, that the anger has been solved?
Well, because, you know, I just want to say, you know, in response to David's important point about the kind of odd dysfunctional anomalousness of the system with which we're stuck, which you say is getting odder, you could make the argument that actually the success of the Democrats actually was the result of something that is sort of normal about the, it may need to be more and more normal, by which I mean people organizing locally about traditional material concerns, healthcare, all those sorts of things, worrying about minimum wage, whatever it is going to be. And they mobilized, and they did have an impact, didn't they, on the turnout. So in that sense, the machine is ticking along.
When you look at the exit polls, which are always very inexact and they're very preliminary still, Trump's best group, people made more than, by income, people made more than $200,000 a year. His worst group, people who made less than $30,000 a year. And everything sorted itself in between.
So if you were fighting as a Democrat now, who would you put forward? How would you do that?
Well, I think the Democrats have...
Because they're already painted, aren't they, as the party of big money, right? That may be a falsehood.
Well, except that, yes, but that's... The Republicans are the party and have become more so. This is one of the ways that 2018 departs from 2016. In 2016, Donald Trump did quite well with people at the economic middle, even though he did best. I mean, he beat Hillary among people who made more than $200,000 a year. But now it looks like a very traditional map. The challenge for the Democrats is this. Only about a fifth of the country is really progressive, and they're concentrated in the coasts. But the Democratic Party is at risk of persuading itself that those people are a potential majority, and they just aren't.
Okay.
That Beto O'Rourke is not going to be president of the United States, ever. And if the Democrats convince themselves that he might be, they're going to go down a doomed cul-de-sac.
Simon, what do you do when you have two sides of the country that actually, it's not that they don't listen, they can't even hear what the other is saying without assuming it's a falsehood?
It's extremely difficult to say, because, you know, none of the the debates really are performances of mutual antagonism, and actually the public appetite for debates, I'm talking about television debates now, is essentially a branch of entertainment, as Donald Trump well knew. You know, it's essentially it's essentially a form of gladiatorial entertainment. The difficulty is, as we often say, is that there are two kind of weird ways of political communication. Social media have made the possibility of enjoying reciprocal hatred more and more enticing for those who are entrepreneurs of hatred.
So do you think we actually love it?
I think actually Donald Trump did tap into the glee, the adrenaline rush of loathing. The rallies are all built around that. My impression about the 2018 campaign was actually that the madness of the rallies, which he enjoyed working into a lather, did not work well for him. For example, in Montana, he hated John Tester, the Democratic incumbent, because Tester got in the way of his nominee for veteran affairs, and it did not work. It did not work.
He's also fairly deeply rooted in Montana, though. But a question to you, which is when Trump said, I would change my tone. I'd love to change my tone, but, you know, they won't let me. There is a lot of truth in that. His base don't want him to change his tone. Right. The media, to be really frank, don't want him to change his tone. Everyone profits from or enjoys the angry Trump performance.
And the voices in his head don't want him to change his tone. So the important thing to understand about Donald Trump...
Ivanka wants him to change his tone.
He's not a strategic thinker. So people often
Are you sure?
I am sure. So here's what happens is Donald Trump does something, and that very intelligent commentators work backward to come up with a theory of how this could possibly make sense. And they ascribe that theory to the president. But he is just driven by impulse. And it's like trying to... he can say, maybe it would be better if I weren't alienating every college-educated woman in the United States. And then the moment comes, and he can't control himself.